Fantastic. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Let's Talk About Sex webinar. Lovely to have you guys all along, and hopefully you'll find it an informative hour. My name's Julia Baines. I'm the National Sales Manager here at CRV. Also worked for a number of years as a cow vet with some lovely farmers around the Waikato. And I'm joined by a couple of panelists tonight. Unfortunately, Simon from Genus couldn't make it. So James Smallwood, who's the General Manager here at CRV Oceania, has stepped up. He'll be able to talk to us a bit about the sex semen technology. And I'd also like to introduce Katrina Roberts. Katrina is a herd health vet. She's a researcher, Headlands consultant, and also very deservedly took out the Fonterra Dairy Woman of the Year this year. So it's wonderful to have you along. Thanks for joining us, Trine.
Thanks, Julia.
So before we get into some of the detail, let's just have a look at what we want to cover off tonight, So first off, we thought it would be good to set the scene for you all, just around some of the trends and the facts that exist around sex semen, what we see in New Zealand and what we also see globally. A bit more about the technology, specifically the technology that we employ here through CRV to produce the sex semen for our dairy farmers. Also, I think, and this is really the guts of what we want to get to tonight, is how we set everybody up for success using sex semen on farm, because it can have some very real benefits, but also it does need to be treated pretty carefully in order to get the best results. A bit of an on-farm example for you all, just to see how that could look in practice. And we will allow a bit of time for Q&A at the end as well. So happy to take any questions that you have, and we'll do our best to answer them for you. So you're all aware, the session is being recorded and will be shared out to those that registered for the event and more widely afterwards, so that those who can't attend tonight can get the benefit of the information. As I mentioned before, we do welcome questions throughout. We will address questions at the end of the webinar. You'll see a question box within your Zoom screen, so feel free to type your questions in there as we go, and then we will run through those and cover them off at the end of the session. I will get you guys to help give us a bit of feedback along the way as well. So we do have a few polls where we're interested to get your thoughts on the product, on its usage and how you've found it on farm. So you'll see those pop up on screen, so pretty self-explanatory when they appear. And finally, we really do welcome your feedback. We have run a couple of these webinars in the past, but first one on this topic. So please let us know what you think of the content, and that'll help us to produce more of these in the future for you. So let's start with a bit of a poll. Let's just see who's out there and who's listening. So we're going to start off with a poll around your own experience with sex semen. Now, I appreciate that we'll have some rural professionals on the call as well. Do feel free to contribute for what you guys have seen out there in the field. So I'm going to chuck that up here there now. So you guys will be able to now vote. But really, we know that there's wide-ranging experiences with this product out there. Have we just started using it? Are we dabbling? Or are we experienced users? And we also know that there are people out there who will have had varied experiences, some not so good. So always good to see how that's gone as well. So interesting. So a bit of a split at the moment. So looks like we've got some, some of you guys have basically given it a go over the last few years, along with some of the more experienced users mixed in there, which is good. So hopefully we can expect some good questions out of you all. Just let that run for a few more seconds and I'll let you guys have a bit of a look. So yeah, it looks like the majority of the people who are voting here have given sex semen a go over the last few years. And also it's really good to see that we've got some interested parties who haven't necessarily used sex semen, but are interested to learn a bit more about the product. So hopefully by the end of this hour, you guys will be a bit better informed and be able to make some of those decisions for your farms. So just a bit of background for you all. Just a nice fun story to start with. So CRV actually introduced New Zealand's proven sex semen to the market back in 2008. We didn't actually have the ability to perform sexing technology in New Zealand at that stage, so we actually flew a team of bulls by air over to the States to get them sexed. So it shows the extent that genetics companies will go to, right, to invest in a bit of technology. We then sort of increased that investment and that belief that sex semen is good for our market here in New Zealand through the introduction of the Genus Intelligent Lab in 2022. So residing with us here in New Zealand to help us produce the best sexed grass-fed genetics that we can. And I won't labour too many of these applications and benefits, but I guess there are the obvious ones that we all talk about and think about with sex semen. So, this is about breeding the best from the best and accelerating genetic gain. And we've seen a lot of that play out well overseas where sex semen is a more readily adopted tool. Which therefore you've got better cows on the ground in the milking herd. We do see more milk in the vat and more money for the farmer as a result. But I think also important to recognise the welfare benefits, both for the cow in producing that heifer calf versus the bigger bull calf, but also, in a world where, we do obviously have bobby calves and we don't necessarily want those male dairy animals out, to actually improve the calf welfare as a result as well by breeding what we want for the future of our New Zealand herd. Just to give you guys an idea of the direction of travel since 2018, for us at CRV, we have seen sex semen being more readily adopted by our customer base. So going from just 0.5% of sales back in 2018, we're seeing nearly 5% of our dairy genetic sales coming from sex semen this year. So certainly more and more farmers are wanting to trial the technology, and for those who have used it and seen it work well, are embracing it year after year as part of their breeding plan. I think it's interesting also to recognise that, in some of the overseas markets, so when we look at the UK, 3/4 of their dairy semen there is sex semen now, and that jumped up from 10 years ago, just 15%. So we do expect that sex will continue to grow as a proportion of the dairy genetic sales in New Zealand, which is all the more reason to make sure that all of you and that the wider market is aware of the facts around the product and how to best get the results that you want from it. So in terms of why this matters and where the value is, I guess, on the ground on our dairy farms, we know from industry statistics, and Fonterra has been really pushing this message as well over the last 6 months to a year, that we know if we look at dairy herds, so the whole Fonterra herd, so across 500,000 cows, but even herd to herd. So here's one herd example that we've pulled out from our data here at CRV. A cow in the top quartile, so in the top 25% of the herd, is doing 165 kilos more milk solids than those in the bottom quartile every lactation. And if you look at the current payout figures, you're looking at about $1,400 from those top quartile cows per lactation. So the difference is significant. And obviously, it does put the focus on where we're breeding from, where we're getting those replacements from, and what the value of those top cows are for you and your business. And again, another example. So this is another anonymous example from a herd that we've been looking at and helping designing a breeding plan for through CRV. These statistics in terms of where replacements are being kept is very repeatable across a lot of the herds that we come across. So when we look at this, while obviously we want to be getting those replacements from the top quartile, you can see there the difference there in the BW and the milk solids as well, but ultimately keeping 20% from that top quartile, but I guess more importantly, keeping 20% from that bottom quartile of the herd is not going to help to drive those gains as quickly as we would like. So this really is about focusing in at an individual herd level about how we do breed the best from the best. Well, we're here to talk about sex semen tonight. I think it's important to recognise that even if we just look at breeding our replacements from the top 75% of an average herd, that when you look at those replacement heifers on the ground and look at their breeding worth average, you'll get a 20 BW lift in the average of that replacement group. So just by targeting in on that top 75% and getting the breeding from the top of the herd, or specifically not breeding from that bottom 25%, you're going to get an extra 1 year's annual genetic gain this year. So all the more reason really to think about more closely where those replacements are actually coming from. So again, I mean, I have the privilege, and with my team, spending a lot of time out there talking with our customers. And I guess, one of the reasons that drove us towards running this session tonight is that we are hearing a lot of different things out there from our customers and from farmers in general about sex semen performance and what it's being used for out there. So we go all the way from the range of, we've got farmers out there who are seeing no conception rate difference between their conventional and their sex semen performance on farm. And in some cases, actually a better performance with pregnancies from sex than conventional. But that range is quite wide. I've also had discussions, where we're looking at results that are quite disappointing, with a large conception gap between conventional and sex use on the farm, and really trying to make sure we've got a good plan in place to narrow that gap and to get the results that we want for all of our farmer customers. I guess a couple of other things that we've heard, and again, things that we really want to tackle tonight as well, is that we know that there will be years or individual farms where reproductive performance can be a challenge, and it can be a really hard goalpost to move year to year. But trying to use sex semen to sort of breed out of a poorer repro result is a dangerous approach to take, and is something that we really want to help support with to really get those repro results humming and look at where sex can be used appropriately. We've also heard examples where we've had sex straws going into non-cyclist cedar cows, and I guess this to me, is where we, this isn't where we want to be and want our farmers to be investing their money in terms of a sex straw. Do we want to be breeding from our non-cyclist cedar cows? I guess would be the first question. But also we know these are likely to be lower fertility animals on average, so we certainly don't want to, make the results even worse for that group, and we want to keep the focus on what we're using those cedars for. So really just wanted to cover off with you guys the facts, because I think there's a lot of noise out there in terms of product performance, and certainly in sales and marketing, we like to sell all of the benefits of our products and services. So let's focus on the science for a minute, because I think that's really where we all need to ground ourselves with sex semen. So if we look globally and we look at all the studies that have been done, independent of any genetics provider, or, and with full knowledge of what data and what information's feeding these studies, we do see a conception rate gap between conventional semen and sex semen. And as I say, that's true of all of the sexing technologies globally. And that basically relates to a couple of key points relating to this product and the technology that's used to produce it. So I think one key thing is that what we do see is that individual bulls have different levels of semen fertility. And while we put stringent quality controls around that, there is a variability between individual bull performance. And interestingly, a bull that can have excellent semen fertility with conventional semen may not sex very well. And these are things that are ongoing in terms of the studies that are being performed. And as I say, we monitor for quality control closely. But I think this is also when we speak to our customers about putting together a team of bulls, this is to address the fact, because it's true in conventional too, that individual bull performance would vary, and we want to make sure we manage that across a team of bulls rather than putting all of our eggs in one basket. It's also true of all sexing technologies that sex semen is a lower volume product in terms of the cells in the straw. But not just that through the processing, and James will talk a bit to this about the technology and the processing technology to create sex semen, that ultimately sex semen is a more fragile product, and that ultimately that all needs to be taken into account when we look at how it's used, and we'll come on to some good hints and tips around that shortly. Again, when we look around the world, frozen sex semen is the dominant product around the world. So there have been a number of studies done on frozen specifically, but the one study that's actually been done in a seasonal pasture-based system, comparing fresh and frozen sex semen, so this was done out of Ireland, showed no significant difference between fresh and frozen sex semen performance in terms of the expected conception rates. So I think another important fact to make the market aware of. And finally, and this really ties into that fragility of the sex sperm cells themselves, that ultimately sex sperm cells do live a shorter lifespan in the reproductive tract after insemination. So these all play, these facts all play a really important part in how we target animals, but most importantly, when we inseminate the semen, to make sure that we time it as close to ovulation as possible. So I guess, covering off a couple of those facts, I think some of those are, there's an understanding out there about, where some of those concerns or challenges may be. But I'd just like to throw it out to the group now in terms of, there are other factors to consider using sex semen and concerns that may exist. So I'm just going to chuck another poll out there just to get a sense from this group. What I guess is your biggest concern regarding the use of sex semen at the moment? So that'll just launch on your screens very shortly. There you go. So let us know. I mean, we've obviously just talked about conception, but and yep, that's certainly leading the charge at the moment. But also some people indicating obviously the cost there, the additional cost of that premium product. I'll just let that run for another few seconds, guys, just to see what we get. So yeah, certainly conception, leading the charge there. I'll post the poll now so you guys can see what I see. So yeah, and rightfully so. And I guess again, as I say, the reason that we're here tonight and the reason that we really want to make sure that we can get as many of these hints and tips out there as possible is that it is possible to close that conception gap and get good results off the back of Sext if it's managed well and there's a good plan in place. Obviously, cost also being a factor as a premium product. We have tried to mitigate that a bit this year with some of our packs, but I think also, and I think it's good to see that some of the audience, it does need to be handled differently. The management is key. And I think that, that hint of the lack of available training or support will hopefully this webinar is the start. And we're going to, we do have other materials and guides coming out to you guys, will help to kind of close that gap and get everybody on the same page in terms of how to best use this product. So before we get into all of the management planning and all of the hints and tips of setting you guys up for success, I'd like to hand over to James to present a little bit more about the technology that sits behind our sex semen. Cheers, James.
Hey, thanks very much, Julia, and thanks everyone for joining the webinar tonight. And as you said, Julia, this is very much around helping people to close that gap and also both in performance but also in knowledge as well. I want to briefly, for the next few minutes, just talk about the technology we're using at CRV here. So in 2022, we established our facility with Genus Intelligent, which is a US-based company, to produce sex semen from our grass-fed genetics program in New Zealand. Now that is being very successful, and I guess since we established it in 2022, Genus Intelligent now are our exclusive provider of that sex technology to CRV, both in the Netherlands and also here in New Zealand. The technology was developed and put into the market in 2017, so it has been around for a number of years. And during that period of time, in excess of 20 million straws have been produced so far. And that's really important that there's that degree of confidence in the product and that size of the market. One thing that Genus Intelligent did was actually provide real choice, because up until they launched in 2017, there was only one provider of the technology globally. Thanks, Jim. So I want to talk about some of the sort of tricks, I guess, of the process. And I guess one of the most important ones, of course, is to actually get the semen cells to line up. So we can effectively create a single flow of the cells which allows the next stage of the process to carry on. Now, getting semen cells to line up is there's two types of technology. One uses what we call a microfluidic chip, which effectively is a piece of technology which, in a flow, actually allows the semen cells to go single file. So that's the first stage of the process, and it is a key piece of the technology. Then the key difference between a female semen cell and a male semen cell, I'll go to the next slide, please, is that a female sperm cell actually contains 3.8% more DNA than a male sperm cell, and that's a physiological difference between the two. So what we do is we expose the semen sample to a dye, and because there's more DNA in the female cell, it actually absorbs more of the dye than the male sperm cell does. And that means that actually when they're put through an optical sensor, they have a different color. And that's how we define the difference between the two, between the male and the female sperm cells. Can I just go forward a couple of slides, Julie, if I could, please? Yeah. And this one. So then we've got the sperm cells lined up and they're traveling through in single file. We have what we call a detection sensor, which is actually a laser, which determines what color the sperm cell is. So if it's a female sperm cell, it will be a darker color than the male cell. And we detect it, and then slightly further down the tube, there's what we call an inactivation laser, and that will deactivate by slicing the sperm cell that we don't want. Now, that may be a male sperm cell, or it could be a sperm cell that we are not able to detect whether it is male or female, or it may be one that is deformed, but we will deactivate it with that second laser. Next slide, please, Julie. So if we look at that, the whole process, I guess, if we start left to right of the slide, we see we have the mixed sample as a conventional straw. It then passes through in a laminar flow through the tube. We have the detection laser, and then we have the ablation laser, which is effectively the deactivation laser. And then all of those sperm cells then go into the straw. And that's a significant difference between the two processes. The process we use is not done under high pressure. So effectively the cells go through the process effectively under gravity, and it's claimed to be easier on the cell in causing less damage. So again, the three phases of it: putting the cells into single file, putting a dye in them, then putting them in a single file, then detecting the color, and then deactivating by slicing the cells we don't want. Go to the next slide, please. But that's a key point to the process, though, is that when you look at a product, one of the CRV's products, under a microscope, you'll actually see some of the sperm cells that have been deactivated. And I've actually circled one in red there where you can see the head has actually been sliced, which has deactivated that cell. But the important point to remember is when you look at a CRV sexed semen sample, you will see both the activated cells plus also the viable female cells as well in that sample. So it's all very well having a great process, but the process starts on the farm with collection. So again, we've got to make sure that the product that we're putting into the laboratory to be sexed reaches the highest possible standards. And at CRV, we've made a commitment to sex our best bulls and make those available. So as with our normal semen production, we have a quality process to determine which to make sure that that sample is appropriate, and then that goes through into the laboratory. Once it's in the laboratory, we test it post-production for what we call skew rate. Now, skew rate is a percentage of female to male cells. To make sure that it actually meets those criteria, and we have a minimum criteria of 90% skew rate. Motility is also measured, and also dose rate. So to make sure that post-thawing, there is a minimum number of viable cells in that straw, because it's irrelevant really the number of cells that go into the straw. It's actually the number of cells that survive the process and the thawing process that are important, because they're the ones that are going to create the pregnancy. And the final step is actually making sure we've actually bacteria test the sample to make sure that there is no unwanted pathogens in that sample, which again can affect the conception rate of the product. So that's in a nutshell how we go about what we do at CRV through the genus intelligent technology. So I'll hand back to you now, Julia. Thanks.
Thanks very much, James. Awesome. So hopefully now everyone's sort of aware of the tech and a little bit of the background, but I guess, coming back to some of our polls and some of what we've indicated before, really what this is all about is setting up for success with sexed semen on farm. So we're going to run through a few of our key topics here around your objective setting for your use of sexed semen in the first place, through to animal identification, making sure you've got that plan, along with good heat detection, making those important cow-side decisions at insemination, and also timing of insemination itself and how that can look practically on farm. So we'll start with being clear on your objective. So this session, Trina and I are going to just have a bit of a chat back and forth. Obviously, I can do some of the science and the theory, and Trina very much can do the real life, what she's seen on farm and what will work best out there to get those results. So I guess when we look at breeding and breeding the best from the best, here we sort of, there's a couple of key things that we kind of focus on, I guess, more through CRV, which is the highest genetic merit, which, ranking the cows and targeting that way. But also fertility is a pretty important factor, because obviously the more fertile the cow that's being inseminated, the more that we're going to be closing that gap and getting that pregnancy from the sexed straw. So I guess, Trina, thinking about your experience here and where you've seen sex work well, but where you would recommend it, what sort of repro results? I mean, where would you like to see sexed semen being used and adopted on farm?
Thanks, Julia. Thanks for having me involved in the webinar as well. I can't believe I haven't said anything until now. It's not like me. So yeah, if we're talking about herds using a technology like sexed, which potentially does influence conception rate, we want to make sure that the herd is achieving high reproductive performance, so they've got the ability to be able to buffer some of that potential drop in conception rate. So we want to be having herds that are in the top 25% for 6-week in calf rate, ideally. And if you're not in that position as a herd, but you're really excited about considering the use of a technology like sexed, I think the key is sitting down with your rural professionals, in-calf advisor, vet, breeding company representative, and actually coming up with a plan such that you can be using it the next season or the season after. So I think it's knowing where you are and knowing when you can incorporate the technology if you're not quite there yet.
Awesome. Thanks, mate. And I guess, the other side of that, and obviously those good repro results help where you've got that nice compact calving pattern and the cows have got a lot of time to recover. But we obviously, we highly recommend, and I guess the best science tells us to use sexed semen in the first 3 weeks of mating. That's a very real difference in fertility, isn't it, and non-return rates when it comes to those early calvers versus their late calvers in terms of what we see out there.
Most certainly. And I think also at the other end, when we are having calves born from sexed semen, there's a huge win in terms of the calves that hit the ground, because they are closer in age group, which means they're easier to manage for the farm staff, and they hit target weights earlier, and then they feed back into the herd as better animals. I guess leading into the earlier calves being born that are keepers and having those higher numbers at the front end, it's just being aware of having a plan. Once again, having a good plan set up for managing potentially those surplus heifers, and the timing of the calvings such that you've got keepers coming through the sheds.
Sure. And I guess that kind of feeds into that really where we think about calculating the number of replacement heifers you need, because I guess, that picture does change. We always talk sort of, 20%, 25%, depending on the farm. But, that picture does change a bit when you're playing with sex semen along with conventional. Your comments here, be realistic, conservative. I mean, what would your thoughts be, when we think about making those calculations? And then what we do have examples where farmers get a surplus number of heifer calves as a result of using sexed. I mean, how would you go about making that plan if, somebody wants to convert to sexed, I guess, and get the similar number of replacements?
I think knowing what your submission rate and conception rate are in the previous season are a really good place to start, because mostly the biggest predictor of your repro performance this season is your repro performance last season. So using your actual figures for last season's submission and first service conception rate and timesing those out is the very best place to start. And then and in terms of how many heifer replacements you want, that is a very personal decision for a farm, as in order for them to figure out what they want and what's good for their farm and where their farm is at and what stage they're at. So, if they're growing and they're expanding, if they're trying to get rid of, maybe they've got an old herd, or they've got a mastitis issue, or they've got other animal health problems, they're working with yonis and so forth, they may want to keep a higher number of replacements. So making sure that you use your real numbers from your farm when you're doing your calculations, and also being conservative or sensible about the numbers. And then once you've run with sex semen for a year, you can see what numbers you end up coming out with on your farm, and therefore then the following seasons you can use it, base it on the results that you've had your first year.
So I guess then that sort of feeds really into this, how do we get to that target list of animals that we may want to put sex straws into? And we do have examples, and we do have customers out there who are very successfully using sex semen in the mixed age cows, but also in the yearling heifers as well. So I guess when we look at creating these lists, really we are always, the first question we ask really is what's the breeding goal on farm and what's the breeding objective? We know that getting the genetic gains, you want to start looking at indexes, as well as PW, but also, there are other traits that obviously can matter on individual farms. I mean, if one of your farmers approached you, Trine, and said, look, I'm keen for you to help me sort of get this list of cows together. I mean, how do you help wade through these indexes? I mean, where would you start in terms of trying to get a good ranking, for a farmer?
I think obviously farmers can do this individually, or your breeding companies can do it for them. So I know CRV will generate a list, and as will the other breeding companies. But obviously your vet or your in-calf advisor can also help you. The data is all there within MyHerd or Mind Alive, and you can easily generate export custom reports with all of the criteria in there, and then you can rank cows. There's quite good automated systems within Mind Alive to be able to do it in a crude way, but obviously you can do it in a more detailed way too. I think that some of these factors are easily found from the data. So obviously the genetic merit points, the calving date, the fertility BV is really useful to bring in, because that does have an influence. If you see data presented by the industry at the moment, lower fertility BV animals do get in calf less easily. So we want to focus on the ones that get in calf the most easily, and fertility BV is a great place to start. Health records. So if they've gone into MyHerd or Mind Alive, then obviously you can use those. And then obviously cycling in the pre-mating period and target body condition score are going to be things that you're having to do cow side, or maybe in the pre-mating period you're going to have to be checking those off the list. So making sure that you use a combination of the data from software, but also the cow themselves is really useful. And obviously just being sensible. A list of cows is just a list of numbers. I can cull cows really easily, I tell my farmers, with a list of cows. But obviously, what's important to the farmer, as you said, around breeding goals, maybe there's other things that they're trying to focus on as well in regards to somatic cell count. Maybe they're doing milk sampling for Staph aureus, those sorts of things. That may be a criteria for not putting a sex straw into a cow, because the last thing you want is to be spending money on an animal that isn't going to be here next season or the season after. You want to be choosing cows that are here for a while, and of course that you want their daughters always. Yeah, I think there was a comment there around the PW as well. Obviously, in the yearlings, you can't, you don't have access to that PW information. You've only got their genetics from their parents. But in the herd, you can use that PW to really see how those cows are performing in your herd, and how are they producing in your system. So that's quite a useful tool to try and say, look, I want more cows like this cow.
Fantastic. So I guess just coming on to yearlings for a minute, because it is that is quite an important area, I think, for us to focus on for a second. As I say, we do have we do have some of our customers successfully using sex semen, and within the yearling heifers. But I guess treating the picture, it is quite important that we manage that group well, because obviously breeding the you want to be breeding your best from your best, and we know that if we've that basically if we've kept replacements well and we've targeted well, the best genetics should reside in the youngest animals. But I guess there is also the very real aspects of needing those yearlings to be in calf as early as possible, to get them into the herd as early as possible, give them the best chance of cycling and getting pregnant again as 2-year-olds. So in terms of their, just talking a minute about, I've come to you and we're having a discussion about, I want to AB my yearling heifers and I'm thinking about sexed. What sort of advice would you be giving there in terms of targeting and management of those animals?
I think the first is, and the vets amongst us on the webinar will be familiar with this, is that if we're going to be doing any intervention in the yearlings out at grazing or at a runoff, we need to have really good facilities to be able to do those regular yardings. And I don't mean good facilities that are just nice for the people. It's also nice for the heifers as well. We know that stress influences conception rate. It's negatively. So if animals are stressed on the day of AB, that's not a good thing. So we want to make sure that if we are running our yearlings through the yards regularly, that the people that are handling them and the facilities are conducive to a low stress environment. So that's really important. Obviously, the grazier may not even want to have a bar of yarding multiple times. So making sure that the grazier is on board 100% with the idea of doing a synchrony program, and also therefore you can get away with doing sex semen. If you're not doing synchrony in yearlings and you're doing it to heat detection, which I would assume that you're not recommending as a breeding company for sex semen, but if you are doing heat detection, then your heat detection for yearlings is quite difficult for all sorts of reasons. Heifers are very good at removing heat detection aids, each other's and their own, and also tail paint is not very reliable in yearlings that are well grown and fat. So heat detection is very difficult. So I would strongly recommend that, if you were to use sex semen, you would be using a synchrony program of some sort. And obviously then the heat detection is less important if you're using a CEDA program. The other is, obviously, you brought up the point earlier, Julia, around the fact that the yearlings that are currently being generated in most herds are from evenly from across the herd. So 25% of those yearlings are from not very good cows. So if you are looking at doing a sex semen breeding program in the yearlings, you'd want to be excluding the poorer yearlings, or maybe the other way, selecting the very best yearlings to be going into a program. And that would not just be on fertility BV and BW and NZMI, but also on how well grown they are. So we know that size at planned starter mating, weight they hit puberty, is going to lead to a better conception rate. And if we're wanting to try and get the best conception rate with our sex semen, then live weight relative to target is going to be really important. So having a weight nice and early, having an idea of how they've been growing coming into the mating period is super important. Good health, I think that's obvious. We say it's obvious, but a lot of heifers are at grazing that aren't getting adequate trace element supplementation. They're not necessarily getting drenched regularly. There may be other factors that are influencing their health, such as BVD and those sorts of things. And once again, if you're going to be spending money on a product like sex semen, you want to make sure all of these other ducks are in line so that you do get the best results. And then there's a comment there around cycling in the pre-mating period, and I think that goes hand in hand with body weight. Yeah, if you're using if you want to really get a handle on how those yearlings are doing, you maybe would turn up a month or 6 weeks before plan starter mating. You'd weigh them. You'd identify your best animals both on weights and on paper, and then you'd put tail paint on them and see whether or not they're cycling. That would be your best practice.
Great. And I guess
oh no, I forgot something. Sorry, I'm going to butt in.
Oh, good.
Sorry, Julia. The other is just allowing for that risk mitigation of the fact that conception rates may be lower in a yearling program. So starting your plan starter mating at least 2 weeks, if not 3 weeks before your herd plan starter mating, if you're doing a large proportion of them, so that you're allowing the fact that if they don't conceive off that first cycle, then when they come into the herd as a first calver, they're still going to be an early calving animal. So you're not losing out on that milk or that first lactation repro performance.
Well said, thanks, Trine. And I think we'll just look at this one quickly now, but just a real example, Trine, where we talk about the we can look at conception differences in products, but I mean let's look at the conception rate of high performing and low performing or early late calving old and young cows in a herd that you've worked with. 25% difference. I mean, that wouldn't be an unusual kind of result. Certainly from some of the herds I've worked with, if not sometimes bigger than that. So, just really highlights that point. Exactly.
This is a herd where they are consistently achieving 78 to 80% 6 week and calf rate. And if we go in and select the high performing cows that were, younger cows, early calving, they hadn't been seeded, they hadn't had mastitis, they hadn't been lame, they hadn't had calving assistance or a stillbirth. The conception rate on that subgroup was 63% first service conception rate, so above target, so excellent group of cows. And even in this herd that was achieving 80% 6 week and calf rate, I can still find the low performing group, so those older cows, later calving, and the conception rate of that subgroup is 38%. So that's why I think we're so focused on looking at the cows and making sure that if you're going to be enrolling cows into a sex semen program, you're choosing the best cows on paper and the best cows in terms of the factors that are going to influence conception rate.
So before we jump into heat detection, let's just get a bit of a sense of what you guys are using out there. We know obviously there's there's a wide-ranging choices of heat detection aids out there. So just get a bit of a sense what this group is using. Chuck your results in there, guys, and let's just see what sort of range we've got. So obviously, tail paint still being the dominant player in the market, but with the wearables really starting to come to the fore. Cool. So at this stage, yep. So tail paint in the lead, but also interestingly, a third of people still using a combination, which is great. That's always makes my vet heart happy. Right. Let's just have a bit of a look for the group. So yeah, kind of amazing, isn't it? You think 5-10 years ago, you certainly wouldn't see, a quarter of farmers out there using using wearable technology. So hugely valuable tools. But obviously tail paint still being the dominant player there. And as I said, a bit of a combination. So that'll help us with our next section, Trine. So let's get on with it, eh? So, in terms of, I feel like, Trine, we could talk about heat detection plans all night, and we are a little bit limited on our time. So, if you're going to give these guys your three best hints for getting the heat detection plan in place to get sex semen working well, where would you jump in?
We definitely need to have one person responsible for the decision, whether a cow's on heat or not. So having the buck stopping with one person is really important. So that number one point. The whole farm team trained, obviously, is just so that everyone knows how heat detection works on your farm. So I won't go through the whys and wheres we need that to be happening, but obviously that's risk mitigation. If someone gets sick, if someone gets injured, we need to be able to keep putting cows up, otherwise your next season is stuffed. You've got good quality heat detection aids. Obviously everyone's already using something, so I don't need to talk through the choices there. Simple things around drafting gates and equipment working and cow identification and ear tags and all those sorts of things are really important, because unfortunately when a cow is misdrafted or not drafted, it's usually a cow that was on heat that was missed. So you've just missed a really good animal. So a really good animal, a really good candidate for getting in calf or maybe getting in calf to sex, which is really frustrating. But from a sex semen point of view, I think that the regular observation, be it of the data that you've got from a wearable or from the cows themselves by going and doing paddock checks, is really important. And we'll come to this when we go on to timing, but making sure that that becomes a priority when you're using sex semen, because then you'll be able to identify when that cow is starting her heat better, which is what we'll come to when we talk about the timing. The pre-mating heats are essential in the sense that then they help you make good decisions about cows that are that would be enrolled into the sex semen program. So if she hasn't had a pre-mating heat, she is not a candidate. So she was on your list of cows to be given sexed, but when it gets to plan starter mating, she hasn't had a pre-mating heat, so she can't get a sex straw when she comes on heat because her conception rate is going to be 35%. You're not spending money with sex semen on a cow with a 35% conception rate. It's a waste of time. So pre-mating heats are useful for the decision making, but they'll also help you know when that cow is due back on, which means then you can make a better decision about the timing of putting her up, which we'll come to in a couple of slides. And recording your heats, yes, just so you can monitor that. So one person being in charge, regular checks, and then pre-mating for your decision making.
Beautiful. And I guess, I'll talk a little bit to this one as well, because it's a topic that's quite dear to my heart. Is I think Trine, some of the points you made there is actually really important, that regardless of the list and regardless of the plan and everything done well, you've selected more cows than you need, that actually making a good decision cow side about whether she should have a sex straw is really, really critical, and I think is one of the major differences between where we see good successes and less so. So in terms of what we know, that it's not just about timing and knowing that and detecting a heat, but actually the strength of a heat is linked with a higher conception rate by that animal, and also a less of a chance that she'll actually lose that embryo within the first, often in New Zealand, 7 days. And so, we look at, there are different ways to manage this, in terms of, who's in charge of the heat detection plan and how you make those decisions at the time of insemination. But ultimately, if a cow's showing a weak heat, if she's only just coming on, you're not really sure, and you're not, you're just not confident, there's, the best thing to my mind about a frozen sex straw is you can leave it in your bank and you can choose a conventional or a beef straw instead. Actually making a good decision cow side relating to that heat is pretty critical. We often advise, so we sell Estrotex through CRV. Conveniently, they come in a lot of lovely bright colours, and we often, as part of our plan, encourage our customers to put different coloured heat detection aids on the cows who are supposed to be receiving different product, so that you can make a quick decision cow side, but also with the Estratex, you've got that friction rub, and basically you get a sense of how strong the heat has been, which does allow that in the moment decision. But again, it's never wrong to choose a conventional straw, if you're unsure whether the sex straw is going to be the best choice. So timing. So this is always a really interesting topic, because basically the science is great, but the science unfortunately doesn't obviously work on a dairy farm for a living. So ultimately, there's a lot of research that's been done around the timing of sex semen insemination versus conventional, because as we talked about earlier, the sex semen doesn't live for as long inside the cow, so we need to time it well. And so ultimately, the best science tells us that to achieve the best pregnancy rates, we should be timing sex semen insemination 18 to 24 hours after the start of standing heat behaviour. So you can see on the graph at the bottom there, you get a bigger window there from sort of 12 hours after start of standing heat with conventional, but that window for sex semen is considerably shorter ahead of that ovulation at kind of that 28 to 30 hours. So Trine, I guess to help all of our customers and to help farmers out in terms of this timing, practically speaking, most of our guys are on once a day AB. What would your thoughts be? What's the best practical advice we can give to kind of get that timing right?
I think if you're doing if you're on morning AB, so the tech's coming in the morning after milking, and you're doing your paddock checks or you're monitoring your collar data after milking for the next day, those cows that are starting to come on heat at that time, when you go and do your paddock check, say 11 o'clock in the morning or so, or if you look at your collar data, you can see the activity starting at that point in time. Those cows are good candidates for sex semen the next morning. Whereas if you've got those cows that you haven't seen, they haven't been in the sexually active group all day, and you just pick them up in the morning milking, rub for the first time, or they get a spike, or potentially they've got a low heat alert, so they haven't hit their heat threshold yet in your collar technology or your wearables. Those animals are better off, yes, mate them, draft them and mate them as soon as possible after standing heat, we always say, but they would be getting a conventional straw.
Thank you. So we've got time for our quick example before we start taking a few questions out there. So let's put all of this information together and have a look at how this actually plays out. So fairly typical sort of herd here. So 500 cow spring calving herd, wanting 20% replacements, so wanting 100 replacements. And I guess I would be fairly happy with those repro results if they were mine from last season. So and within the top 25% of farms in terms of performance, but I think also more realistic than saying that everybody's going to hit industry targets for 90% 3-week submission rate, 60% conception rate. So a much more real life example of how this how sex semen could be used to get to breed basically 100 of the best replacements you can, but ideally within the first 3 weeks of mating. So I guess before we get into, and I'll hand back over to you, Trine, I think just really just making sure that we're sort of all clear that ultimately breeding 100 of your top cows to sex, and to sex semen doesn't mean we want a list of 100 cows and they will all get those sex straws regardless of what they do. We really want to start with, based on the breeding goals and the ranking that we've used, we really want to give ourselves a bit of fat on that list. So we want to start with a target list of 125 cows, give ourselves some extra cows on there, and in this case, very conveniently, that is the top quartile of the herd. So starting with a bigger target list would be the logical place to start. So Trine, do you want to have a bit of a chat through how this plays out in terms of within those 3 weeks?
Yeah, so if you're achieving 85% submission rate, then you're putting up 20 to 21 cows on average every day. And if we're targeting the 100 for sex semen, then 4 to 5 of those animals each day are going to be eligible for sex semen on average. I mean, cows don't follow the rules, but that's what you've got. And I think the key there is that if we've got 6 or 7 target cows on the yard, so we've made them in pink there, you can make the decision on the day based on the heat criteria that we discussed. So are they having a strong heat? When did their heat start? Are they going to achieve the best results to sex based on that? Have they had a short return? All those sorts of things we can opt in or opt out for those animals and end up with the 4 best animals of the 6 that have presented themselves. Cow condition might be another one. So there may be cows that have lost condition. Maybe they've had mastitis since you've made the list. Maybe they've gone lame since you've made the list. So we basically, of our target cows, you can actually take the subset that are going to give you the best conception rate. They're not necessarily the best in terms of the highest figured animals, but they're the best cows that are going to give you a chance of getting a conception to that sex on that day.
Awesome. And I guess when we then look at what the result would be, so bearing in mind these numbers have been crunched on, if you like, the biggest conception gap that we would see based on the studies of sex versus conventional. And realistically, we've just talked for nearly an hour about closing that gap. So results should be better than this. But even if we look at that 10% gap, if you've if you've focused those 100 straws into your top quartile cows, so those sex semen straws, with the conception rate, but also with the 90% skew of replacement heifers, you're still looking at on farm 41 replacement heifers from those top cows using sex semen in the first 3 weeks, and that compares with 28 if you would use conventional in those same cows alone. So there is still, there are good gains to be made there in terms of, moving, breeding the best from the best and moving that dial in terms of the genetic gain. Ultimately, those 59 other replacements can come from that next tier of cows with conventional. But let's not forget as well that if we're into things nice and early and cows return well, there will be the opportunity to get some additional replacements from those top tier returns as well. So ultimately also allowing and freeing you up to really breed the bottom quartile to either a terminal beef product or conventional, depending on the situation, but ideally not keeping that calf either way. And I guess when you just run some basic modelling over this, if we look at keeping 13 replacement heifers more from the top quartile cows every year versus just doing, just keeping that spread across all of the quartiles, that those animals on their own over their lifetime, those 13 animals on their own with those extra milk solids every season could deliver 90k over the course of their lifetime in your herd. So every year that this approach is taken, there are real opportunities for gains there. So thank you very much, Trine. It's a shame we don't have you and me could always talk for hours, but it's been really great, mate. Really appreciate your help on this one. So really, just to round off, we're nearly coming up to the hour. We'll just take a short few minutes for questions at the end. But ultimately, hopefully, you guys have found out something new, something useful from the presentation. We really do believe that sex semen is an existing technology that is here and now to help New Zealand dairy herds drive genetic gain and also to fast track some profitability and get more milk in the vat more quickly over the coming years. And that ultimately, while there is, that we acknowledge the conception rate difference, that ultimately through careful planning and animal selection, we have seen some real successes with our customers. And we really do want all of our farmers and all of our customers to see some good successes with this product because they are there to be had with some careful planning. Just making sure you've got that plan in place to target the best animals, whether it be the cows or the yearlings that you want to target, and work with your vets, work with us, work with your breeding consultants and your farm consultants to really target that list well and have more animals on there than you need to give yourselves flexibility at the time of AB. And I guess finally, that breeding plan coupled with good heat detection really is the critical piece for success. So we will make breeding plans routinely for our customers, focusing sexed, conventional and beef based on breeding goals. But, we're always here to help. And, the more planning that can be done, the more likely you are to have success with this product. So that's a wrap from us. Like I said, a busy hour and a lot of information. So, James, I've had you on point, just having a look, just to see what Q&A, guys. We'll only have a few minutes for this. I appreciate everyone's got their evenings to get back to, but we'll just see if we can cover off a couple of questions before we wrap it.
Sure, no, thanks, Julia. There's a couple of questions on so far, but if there are any others, please feel free to lodge them on the where you do. The first one's from Matthew, and it's probably just reconfirming, and throw it to you, Julia, but I'm sure Katrina will have a comment too. But the question is there any data to confirm using an optimum window has on increased conception rate using either fresh or frozen? And I think it's just really asking more around that slide you covered off with the breeding or the optimum times for various products. Let's just recap on that.
Sure. So basically, yes, there have been studies done. So I guess they've cut them a couple of different ways. Typically, all of these studies, because they're performed overseas, a lot of them have been done with synchrony or CEDA programs. So the timing is often estimated based off the back of those programs, rather than, if you like, a natural mate scenario per se. Yes, so those figures have been derived, and effectively those windows have been looked at predominantly from a frozen sex semen perspective overseas, because that is the predominant product, but that is where those figures come from. And as I say, they are a combination of CEDA programs and PG programs that have driven those. Basically the study coming out of Ireland, which directly compared fresh and frozen, suggested basically a similar window for insemination for both of those products, that it needed to be closer to ovulation, but there was no significant difference around that. The only real difference was around the number of days after which the fresh had been sitting there. Basically, the more days that the fresh had been had been, I guess, away from the bull, the more the conception rate came down. But those figures have come from multiple synchrony studies. Yeah. Hopefully that answers that.
Cool. Hey, thanks very much, Julie. Just another question from Louise, going, would you recommend, and I'll probably throw this to you, Katrina, to answer first, but would you recommend a fixed time insemination program over a Y weight or double PG for heifers?
Good question. For using sex semen specifically, is that what it's relating to? Yeah.
I assume so.
Yeah, excellent. The Y weight, the data that we've got comparing head-to-head PG programs with fixed time AI inseminations is quite old data now. But when it was done in New Zealand more 15 years ago or so, the conception rates were far better with a fixed time AI program. So, the predominant reasoning for that is that a lot of heifers were not at puberty, had not hit puberty in that study. So I think that the CEDA program, the fixed time AI CEDA program, is your best risk management strategy for making sure that you get better results with any AB in your heifers, and particularly obviously in sexed if you're using sexed. There are options now around slightly different programs to what was trialed back then. There are a few tweaks to the program that are currently being used in New Zealand on the back of some overseas work. But we probably don't have really concrete data to say that the different length CEDA programs are necessarily going to give a better result just yet, particularly with the sex semen. But I think that if your vets recommend a slightly different program for the CEDA program for yearlings, then go with what their recommendation is. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Katrina. Another question just from you, Julia, from Nathan. Just some advice on the best way to handle sex semen while inseminating. It's probably an area we haven't covered off particularly in this presentation, but is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, so I guess I mean we all of our AB technicians are trained to follow best practice protocols, but I guess the key things are that you don't want to have those straws thawed for excessive periods before they're inseminated into the cow. So realistically, you really do want them thawed and then within the cow within that sort of 10-minute window. And also we recommend the use of the straw thawing unit. So you want that slow, controlled return to body temperature. And realistically, there are multiple ways to do that, but the thawing units give you the most reliable return. So really practically on farm. So if you're DIY, I think the main thing is just to thaw the straws as you sort of go and take your time. Don't sort of try and make the job more efficient and thaw all the straws and then be still on the yards inseminating 20 minutes later with those straws thawed. Slow return to normal temperature, and I guess all of the other normal straw handling applies. So obviously just making sure that the straw is dry, that it's kept out of direct light, that we're not got chemicals and other things around in the sheds that can sort of interfere with that semen. Yeah.
Thanks, Julie. I think the other point that came up from the AB seminars was just also making sure the guns are warmed as well. We didn't cover that off. So yeah, there's some good advice there. The other question in from Justin is there a significant, Katrina, you probably best want to answer this one. Is there a significant difference between twice a day AB per day compared to once a day in terms of conception rates, particularly with collars where the timing of insemination could be improved compared to traditional heat detection? You touched on a little bit, but perhaps if you just expand a little bit on that one.
The only data that we've got on that said that there was no difference in our New Zealand system between twice a day and once a day insemination on conception rates. And that is reasonably old data, and it was pre-collar technology. I think if you're looking at a product like sex semen, the timing of insemination is definitely more crucial. And I guess that potentially it would be a situation where you would see a benefit in using twice a day insemination if you were solely doing sex semen. But the point here is that we're not trying to, if you're trying to use sex semen, you're using it in your very best cows, which ends up being a low percentage of the herd, so 20 to 25% of the herd, which means that on any given day, you're not going to have very many cows that you're actually going to inseminate to sext, which means then you've got the option of choosing cows based on their heat detection window, using your collar data to look at when they started heat, and then those are the animals that will be inseminated once a day at the appropriate time window. So I think that we've got, because of the way we recommend sex semen being used, and Julia, you can tell me if I'm speaking out of turn, the need to go in with twice a day insemination to get better results with sex, I don't think is there. But I guess if you say what's the industry going to look like in 10 or 15 years time, can't answer that. And I guess potentially with collar technology, we do have the opportunity to revisit some of these studies that were done without collar technology. So it's a fair question. But at the moment, I think you can just use the rules that we've kind of set out to kind of optimize the cows that you put up for sext.
Thanks, Katrina. Julie, during the presentation, you made a comment about the difference between fresh and frozen in respect to that timing, and the fact that is there anything you want to say about that?
About the timing of, sorry, James?
The fact that you've got the product in the tank that is available there.
Yeah, sure.
A set number of cows coming on every day.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's to us anyway, given that best information tells us there's no significant difference between fresh and frozen. the fact that you can actually choose, opt not to inseminate, that, you don't have a quota of straws there that you need to use. We don't have that pressure to basically inseminate the sex straw at that time, does give that flexibility to around that once a day AB window or otherwise, to be able to, target those cows as and when you want them, but not to have to use a product if it's not the right timing or it's not fitting in the right window for AB. Yeah.
Thanks for that. I think just the last one to wrap up the evening, it's an interesting one, and I'm hanging on both of your answers here, but why do you think New Zealand is so far behind the rest of the world in its uptake of
Good question.
I'll let you go first, Train.
I guess the only comment I can make would be is that the predominant breeding company that we have in New Zealand has only had a sex semen product in the last maybe 10 years. Would that be fair? I don't know when it was launched. So that would be probably the biggest reason why there hasn't been a longer history of its use here. I think that farmers are very focused on conception rate here. Because we're a spring calving system and we rely on our calving pattern and our repro performance to generate profit, I think it's very hard for our average herd to accept a lower conception rate in a subgroup of our best cows. So I think that going in with a technology that definitely has potential to improve genetic gain, but at the cost of a lower conception rate, doesn't make sense to a lot of rural professionals, and myself, I definitely am one of those, in regards to making sure that the farm is ready to be able to use sex semen. And so I think, whereas if you're in a year-round calving environment, then you can tolerate a lower conception rate off a specific straw because you just give that cow another go, and that's not impacting your profit in the same way as what we are here. That would be my off the top of my head thought process on that.
Yeah, and I'd probably, I agree a good chunk of that, Trine. I mean, I think also, to my mind, it boils down to that higher cost of the pregnancy overall, and that relates to obviously some of the the conception challenges, but it's also been the cost of the product itself. You look overseas and these products are, we pay a considerable amount in New Zealand for our genetics compared to some of those overseas markets, just because of the volumes and everything else. So I guess, to my mind, our challenges at CRV is to make sex semen as accessible as possible for our customers. And I think we've gone a long way to trying to do that this year, to kind of make it a more viable option cost-wise from that side. But again, it's that shift away from the idea of cows and calf to, we want cows and calf, but we actually want to get the replacements from the best animals. And a lot of that also boils down to some of our appetite in New Zealand for products like DNA. That ultimately we could be thinking we're keeping the best from the best and breeding well, but if we've got 25% mismothering, there's an additional complication there, and farmers do get good support for those sort of services and products overseas as well. That there are other things in place at a national level to kind of support with that genetic gain. But I think we just the big thing for us is that you work one-on-one with the farmer and look at their repro performance, look at their breeding goals, and then you make the right assessment for the right products on for that farm. And hopefully, in the future, sex semen is there, but we need to make sure that we look after, the basics first.
That's great advice. Thanks, Kevin. That's pretty much the question, so I'll hand it back over to you.
Fabulous. Okay. Thanks, James. All right. Well, we'll wrap it up. Conscious that it's nearly 8:15, so thank you guys for all hanging in there with us. We will send this recording around. So if there's anything that you've missed or anything that you want to recap, you can obviously go back and have a listen to that section. You guys, do feel free to contact us and complete the survey. But if you've got any particular questions about your farm or any other burning questions that you haven't been able to ask, do feel free to give us a shout here at CRV, and we'll be happy to help. And really just a final thank you to my panelists. Thank you, James, for stepping in and doing a wonderful job of the tech. And Treen, it's always a pleasure, mate. Really appreciate your support, and yeah, it's just been great to have you along, and some great advice as always.
Thanks, Julia.
All right, well, good luck with the mating season ahead, everyone, and hopefully you get to take a little bit of a breath between calving and mating, but look after yourselves, and hopefully that sun keeps shining, eh? All right. Thanks, guys. Have a great night. Cheers. Bye. Are we back in the green room?
I don't know. We got rid of James. I don't know how you did that.